dear Anya Schiffrin, dear Paula Cipierre, dear Gerd Hamann, dear viewers. As a program director of the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles, I would like to warmly welcome you to our program, Restoring Public Trust, Regulating Big Tech. Today we are connected between LA, Italy, and Hamburg. Zoom and other digital media platforms have become important forums for open discussion and exchange. And at the same time, the concentration of gatekeepers, disinformation, and propaganda threaten our liberal democracies. Media corporations have contributed to the erosion of public trust in our democracies in recent years. Just a few days ago, EU states and the EU Parliament agreed on the Digital Markets Act, and also a Digital Services Act is on its way. But will this really lead to a reduction in the concentration of power of media corporations? And will they assume finally more social responsibility in the future? I'm pleased that we have two distinguished experts, Anya Schiffrin and Paula Cipierre, as guests who will discuss legal and political responses to the challenges posed by big tech companies with Götz Hamann. We are grateful for the good cooperation with the ZEIT Foundation, and in particular, I would like to thank Sascha Surke and his team, as well as my colleague, Benno Herz. I'm looking forward to a hopefully stimulating discussion and hand it over to Gerd Hamann. Thank you.
Yes, thank you to all of you, to everybody, to the ZEIT-Stiftung in Hamburg and the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles for hosting this conference and for inspiring this panel. The timing could not be better, and we will see soon why. Let me start with a short remark before I introduce my two panelists. In terms of logistics, Anya Schiffrin joins us from New York. Welcome, Anya. Paula Cipierre and me, we are in Hamburg, and our audience is split between LA and the rows in front of us. We have 60 minutes, and I'm going to open up the discussion for questions after perhaps 45 minutes, but if anybody of you really wants to jump in and enrich our conversation, please feel free. We have a mic somewhere around. If you raise your hand, we'll get that done. I have only one request. If you ask a question, please ask a question. So off we go. When we say big tech, we mostly refer to platforms. Platforms in the public sphere or platforms in open societies have had a difficult relationship, at least since 2016, since social media played a role in so many countries, in so many issues. I won't mention them now. I do not name the platforms as well right now, not because of a Voldemortian-like angst, but because I'm sometimes just tired of naming them. We have seen the freedom of speech misused at great scale, but we also have seen civil society cooperating with platforms and trying to restore public trust. We've seen a lot of goodwill expressed by platform executives, and many decisions you could call random, arbitrary, and high-handed. Banning Trump, not banning Trump. Dimming down traditional news, but promoting emotional, divisive posts. Deleting hate speech in Germany, but ignoring much of it in Slovakia, Poland, or Hungary. And the same is true for many countries in Asia. So we see platforms taking responsibility for content in some cases, but denying it in general. All of this fuels distrust in the public sphere, and we want to discuss if there's a chance and a way to restore trust by regulating big tech. Anya, in the recent years, you have focused on big tech and news, big tech and the public sphere. For everybody who does not know you yet, Anya Schiffrin is the Director of Technology, Media and Communications at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Some of her latest publications include the book Media Capture: How Money, Digital Platforms and Governments Control the News, and Disinformation, Fake News and Democracy for the Journal of International Affairs, to name only two. Anya, please, the first question to you. What are the main findings of your latest book I mentioned? And if you take these findings, how did they influence the trust in the public sphere? How would you put it? We can't...
Sorry, can you repeat your question, please?
Sure. Anya, what are the main findings of your latest book I mentioned, the media capture? And how did they influence the trust in the public sphere? How would you put it?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for asking about my book. It's always a pleasure when someone's interested in my work. I spent many years working on this question of how can we support quality journalism and get quality information out to the public, and what are the obstacles? Before 2016, I worked a lot on investigative journalism in the Global South, and I had many happy years studying African investigative journalism. One of the obstacles to quality information for the public is when journalism isn't able to function properly. And so the book, the 3 volumes I edited on media capture, are about situations when government and corporations collaborate to censor journalism. I hear a lot of an echo. I wonder if anybody can hear me.
We can understand you quite well. I think I look in the audience. Yeah, thumbs up.
Oh, great. I'm so glad to hear it. But it's so interesting. So then, like many academics, after 2016, I had to start paying attention to mis and disinformation and all the terrible things that Google and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and everybody were doing. So in recent years, I've been really trying to figure out, along with many, many other people, what are the solutions? And that's really what got me interested in regulation. But there are many dimensions to trust, and I'm happy to talk about more of them. I don't know whether you wanted our other esteemed panelists to speak, or if you would like me to talk a little bit more about trust.
I'm sure we'll come back to that. But let me add one question. How would you describe the difference before and after 2016 in terms of trust in the public sphere?
Yeah. So I think that 2016 was a watershed moment because obviously mistrust has always existed and lies and propaganda have always existed. But when we saw the vote for Donald Trump, we saw the incredible lies that were circulating on social media and votes for Brexit and some of the violence in the Global South where people were riled up by Instagram. I think all of a sudden, a huge amount of attention was put on the tech giants, and people suddenly realized how much power they have and got very worried about it. And so that's when I think the sort of worries about mis and disinformation online seeped into the general public and became a topic that now everybody is very worried about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Before we start to discuss the question what to do about it, I'd like to introduce Paula as well. Paula works for Palantir, a leading data analytics company. It serves US governments and some Western intelligence agencies. It's with its software, and it's used in the German police in Bavaria, I think, and you told me something coming up in Hessen as well?
Hessen and North Rhine-Westphalia, and now in Bavaria too, yeah.
Okay. So the nature of your business is being trustworthy and in a way keeping secrets, which makes it sometimes difficult to be trusted in the public sphere. But the company decided, as I understood, to be more transparent, and that is part of your duty. You worked as head of privacy and public policy in Germany and Brussels. Please, Paula, let us know, what does your team do and how does it connect with the topic of our panel, restoring trust in the public sphere?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to, and thanks also to the ZEIT-Stiftung for having me on this panel with Professor Schiffrin. Maybe just taking a couple of steps back as I was preparing for this panel as well, and I started thinking about the issue of trust. It made me reflect upon what elements actually needed to establish a relationship of trust as well, right? And perhaps to keep this simple in the beginning, we can think about it at an interpersonal level, right? Like, what does it mean to trust someone? And I think typically this process consists of getting to know someone. It's difficult to trust someone you don't know, right? And then at some point, it becomes a matter of whether somebody's words are consistent with their actions. And I think when sort of translating this to big tech, I think this is partly also where trust can break down, right? Where maybe a platform is intended to do one thing, but then it intentionally or not results in doing something else. So I think this is maybe a question we can explore together later. As you mentioned previously, I do work in a very different kind of platform environment, right? I don't work for a social media company. I work for a company that provides software that enables not only governments but also private sector companies to integrate data of various kinds and formats into one environment and to enable them to work with the data more effectively and in a humanly intuitively way. And my role at that company is somewhere between privacy engineering and public policy. So on the privacy engineering side, it's a matter of making sure that we continuously expand upon our privacy protective functionalities to enable our customers to work with their data in a privacy compliant way, which is extraordinarily important both in the government and in the private sector. But of course, because we historically also have worked in highly sensitive data environments, sometimes for us as a software provider, it has been challenging to speak about our work. Now that we have vastly expanded into the private sector as well, it's increasingly important as well to better communicate what we actually do. So I think we have a very long experience building privacy protective technologies. Now we need to get better at actually talking about them and also explaining what we do.
Okay, could you, well, Palantir is known for its relationship with governments in the West, and as you told me in advance, there are a lot of countries you do not work with. But I've not heard so much about Palantir expanding into the private sector, so could you give us an example where your software is used in the private sector, so and where we could get in touch with it?
Of course. So the platform is not exactly consumer-facing, but one example I think that brings home very well what it enables you to do is our long-standing relationship with Airbus. So that's probably a company that many of you know. They're also obviously prominently based in Hamburg. But Airbus has a long-standing partnership with Palantir where they provide a platform that is called Skywise, that is based on our commercial product Palantir Foundry. And it basically enables both Airbus and various airlines to connect in one platform environment, to selectively share data with each other for business or security purposes, but also to develop their own applications or relevant use cases within specific airlines. And I like this use case because it demonstrates how different companies can work together and also exchange data. But it also highlights the importance of exchanging data securely, right? Because obviously some of these airlines are in competition with each other, so they want to make sure that they only share their data selectively. I think another example that will maybe bring home also the importance of data integration and the importance of having a comprehensive overview of data, perhaps also across countries or within the same country, is the work that we did for both the UK and the US government in enabling them to distribute vaccines in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this was obviously a very high-stress situation in which there wasn't a lot of time, but where essentially, obviously, these governments needed to get jabs into arms as quickly as possible. And here as well, even just managing the supply chain of vaccine distribution can be extremely challenging. So enabling various stakeholders across that supply chain essentially to have an overview as to where is their demand, like where can we ship these vaccines, particularly those that expire at some point as well, is extremely valuable. So, I mean, at this point, we probably work in every sector imaginable.
Sorry, I think we see now. Anya, are you talking?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So, great. In terms of understanding what trust consists of, I would say the early scholarship on this was really sort of in the 1950s, and they isolated three components. So, to build on what Paula Cipierre said, one is the credibility of the source. The second is the content of the message. And the third are audience characteristics. So all of those are related to trust, for example, in a message. But it's so interesting because when I heard about this panel, trust in big tech, will regulation help? I started thinking about all the reasons people mistrust big tech nowadays. And it's there's so many reasons that it's going to take, I think, all kinds of regulation. So speaking really from the US, I think one of the first reasons people don't trust large tech companies is they're really worried about their jobs and being replaced by technology. So I think that would be a whole bucket of mistrust, which has certainly contributed the economic insecurity, the fear of AI, the fear of, robots, whether or not it's reasonable. I think that's a whole reason, a whole group of reasons that people don't trust tech companies. And so even though Amazon is incredibly convenient and gives us fantastic products really quickly, everybody's just so worried about labor conditions and the fact that they don't allow unions. So I think labor is one reason there's a great deal of mistrust in large companies. And I think another reason, another bucket of things that people worry about is surveillance. So, for example, I got to know Palantir after September 11th, when Palantir was working in places like Saudi Arabia, right? And they're taking, and again, I'm so not a technologist, and so I'm sure Mrs. Cipierre, Dr. Cipierre will be able to explain it better than me. But from what I understand, Palantir will do things like work for the Saudi government or work for the US government and take a list of everybody applying for US visa and then match it against a list of, have they just been in some terrorist country, right? So it's really useful, powerful work, but it's about surveillance. Or after the 2008 financial crisis, Palantir was brought in to see was there corruption when the government was giving out stimulus money. And again, you might take a list of everybody that got US stimulus money from the government and then a list of all their addresses and see were there 10 people using the same address to apply. So a lot, as I understand, a lot of what Palantir does is sort of, matching those big data sets. And that makes people super nervous because they're afraid of surveillance. So you've got fears about
Anya, what you're mentioning too is the fear of people that they lose their sovereignty, that software, that there are decisions made changing their lives, imposed on algos they can't control, and that are intransparent. And I think
exactly. So that's two. Can I just finish my taxonomy?
Sure.
So I think that's the second. So labor. Surveillance is the second. I think the third thing is tax avoidance. So all of these big companies just aren't paying taxes. And so everybody is so angry about that right now. There was some incredible investigative reporting last year about Peter Thiel, the founder of Palantir. And he took this little savings account that in the US we used to put $2,000 a year away. And now he's got something like, $50 million in a piggy bank. So people like Elon Musk, people like Jeff Bezos, people like Peter Thiel, these big companies, none of them pay taxes. This is a big American problem. So that's a third reason people don't trust them. And then the fourth reason is the thing that you invited me to talk about, which is disinformation, misinformation, and how that can be regulated. But I think when we look at why people don't trust big tech, at least in the US context, I think it's far more than the mis and disinformation. I think there's a whole range of reasons leading to distrust. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. I think we give Paula a chance to reply, and then I think we should start the discussion what to do about it.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the rundown of the taxonomy. I agree. I think these are areas that certainly raise legitimate concern, right? And I think these are precisely the areas where there needs to be greater transparency and also a greater exchange between technology companies and the public, but also the government and the public, right? And just to clarify, with regards to Palantir's origin story, it's true that we were founded in the aftermath of 9/11, and basically a couple of founders of Palantir got together, many of whom were alumni kind of the PayPal world, and one conclusion that they derived from their work at PayPal, where amongst others they were confronted with fraud in online payment systems, right? They experimented with different ways to combat that fraud. And initially they tried to fully automate that process, but that didn't work because essentially the fraudsters could always outsmart the machine. But only human work could not solve the problem either. So at some point they arrived at the conclusion that really the best results could be achieved when technology enables a human being to make better decisions, right? Just by virtue of having access to the information they need to do their work. At the same time, I think 9/11 was obviously a very striking moment in the United States. It was a shock, right? I mean, I think we're sadly experiencing a similar shock now in Europe as well, where essentially the US government was also scrambling to figure out how to respond. And from my personal perspective, and I'm purely speaking personally here, there were certain laws, right, where the US government overreacted, right? There was a series of laws that were passed that made it vastly easier for the US government to collect personal data and sensitive data as well from US citizens and foreigners alike, and perhaps going overboard in that direction as well. Palantir, by contrast, essentially enables both government and commercial institutions to bring together the data that they already have, right? And something that we found actually is that very often you do not need to collect more data. A lot of the information you need to derive meaningful conclusions you already have. More data does not mean better data, right? And I think part of the motivation of creating this technology as well was precisely to enable institutions to better work with the data they already have, and precisely preventing these kinds of scenarios where because of a sense of helplessness or fear, more and more data is collected that isn't actually needed. It is more this targeted search of data that already exists. Aside from that, it's true, of course, that we work in highly sensitive data environments, right? And also environments that create a lot of anxiety because it makes you wonder, well, what is the government actually doing with my data? And what kind of meaningful controls are there in place? And it's precisely for that reason that the company invested very early in my team, right? It's a very unique team, the Privacy and Civil Liberties team. We're a highly interdisciplinary team of software engineers, data scientists, people like me with a law and ethics background, right? And the idea is really to look at privacy from an interdisciplinary and a holistic perspective, and to make sure that certain protections are built into our platforms by design to enable our partners to work with data in a differentiated way. But of course, we are a software provider, right? We embrace regulation because I think by virtue of the fact that we started working in highly sensitive data environments, we had to build a lot of these security protections into our platforms by design. However, to a certain extent, we cannot engage in these dialogues alone, right? Because we do not collect any data. We do not store or process any customer data on our own behalf or for our own purposes. We provide the platform so our customers can process their data in our data environments. So from our perspective, we welcome public dialogue, right, with both our public and private customers to essentially better communicate what they're actually doing, like what the challenges are that they face, why data matters, and how they can process this data in a responsible way to achieve these purposes.
Yes, it's. I think it became quite clear over the last 5 to 10 minutes how complex, how the environment is in which we all work now, and how powerful data analytics has become, how powerful platforms have become, how much data there is, and how much somebody knows about us and about you. And we see, when you look back the 20 years, 25 years of the, well, internet era, then we see a third wave of regulation now. And it's always, regulation comes always after something has changed, after a lot of innovations. And I think we are at a point where there is a lot of consciousness for the challenges that we face in different parts of the digital world. And perhaps we can look at the European Union right now, because there's some regulations on the way, some acts in discussion right now. And I would like to ask Paula and Anya about one of these acts which maybe kind of connects all we have talked about so far. And that's the AI Act. Because it kind of tries to, as I understand, defines what AI systems are, tries to rule out some use cases, for example, social scoring systems, leaves out parts of AI which are said to be not risky, like video games and search engines and so on. But then there are many, many different other fields where AI comes in and where the EU now tries to rein in and regulate it. Why and how is it important for Palantir, and how, Anya, do you look at this act or another? There are some related to that as well.
Sure. So I think before we talk about regulations that are happening, I think we can also talk about regulations that aren't happening. So, for example, Peter Thiel, who founded Palantir, was in the newspaper this week because he's giving tens and millions of dollars to Donald Trump because he's an arch libertarian. So I think when we look at the laws that are getting passed, that's great. But the other problem, at least in the US, is we have all these laws we need. So someone like, part of why nobody trusts these big companies is because we don't trust the people that run them and that started them. People like Mark Zuckerberg, people like Peter Thiel. So he's giving tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to arch, right-wing campaigns. He sued, there was a website, a news site called Gawker, which he didn't like. So he sued them. So they were driven out of business. He just went after. That's what they do in third world countries. That's what they do in the Philippines. Is they sue news sites, legitimate news sites that they don't like. That's what Russian oligarchs do in London. So we've got all of these things that are really terrible and aren't being regulated and are probably not going to be regulated. So I just want to make that as a backdrop before we talk about what is being regulated.
I think Anya, the dystopian part of it, it's very clear to us. So what would be really great if we just at least try to look at some fields that we might be able to do something at, where there is political dynamic and will to do something.
So I was just starting to get to that. Right? So I want to tell you first what's not happening, and then I'm going to talk about what is happening. So one of the things that is happening is that Germany and Europe is very far advanced from the United States. So you had the next Netz DG bill, which we would never have in the US, and that was already, I thought, a big step forward. And now what's going on is that the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act are happening in Europe. And what the Digital Services Act does, and probably your audience knows this better than an American audience would, is it's saying to the large platforms, listen, you have to every year provide an assessment of the risk to society, the harms to society caused by your platform, and then you have to show us what your plan is to deal with those risks, and then we have to be able to come and inspect and make sure you're doing that. So this is not, the tech companies lobbied like crazy. It's not the most draconian legislation at all. But it's a step up from the self-regulation that we've really had in the last few years, where tech companies basically can get away with whatever they want, including Peter Thiel even, was against restrictions on political advertising online. So I think we're all really excited that this is happening. I think it's a piece of legislation which will evolve. I think we're really hoping there's, dozens of bills in Congress right now in the US. And I think we're really hoping that the EU voting on the Digital Services Act is really going to push the United States to do a little bit more than they have. But again, it's a drop in the bucket compared to all the other harms that aren't being regulated and probably never will be regulated.
But Anya, there is one part of the Digital Services Act you didn't mention yet, and that's the idea of establishing a algorithm authority in a way, which connects to the AI Act. That means at least there is the draft of an institution that might have the right and the power to kind of have a look at the principles of how algos or AI works. And have you ever seen something like that before? And then I have the question for Paula, how that might or will influence Palantir's business.
Yeah, I'm definitely not an algorithm expert. My understanding is that France already has something like that, and that they were the people that were pushing to include this in the DSA. But the DSA is evolving. I mean, I was in Brussels in November, and I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago. And each time, I've had conversations with the regulators, different things are being pushed in and out, like always happens.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah. So I don't know if it's going to end up in the bill. I hope so, but I don't know.
Paula.
Yes, absolutely. So my background is in data protection and privacy rights. So I've been following the regulatory developments in that space in particular. Obviously, one watershed moment was the passage of the EU General Data Protection legislation that significantly influenced data protection laws around the world as well, including in the US and California, amongst others, that essentially set a goal of defining certain processing principles around personal data processing in general, right? That there should be a legal basis for processing personal data, that the processing of personal data and other sensitive data should be limited to that which is necessary and proportional to achieve a legitimate processing end. So the GDPR, in a way, set the foundation for how we think about responsible data processing, I think, in many ways. Now, with some of the proposed legislation, for instance, the proposed EU AI Act, right, the European Union is starting to look more specifically at technologies that I think touch upon a lot of the anxieties Professor Schiffrin touched upon earlier, right? Are we losing control over how machines are processing our data? Are decisions being automated? To what extent are these technologies replacing humans? And the AI Act is interesting because the EU once again tried to take a risk-based approach, right? So it classifies different types of AI systems, some of which it considers inherently risky, others of a lower risk, and some of which the EU says, well, maybe this should be prohibited straight off the bat, right? Like these kinds of social scoring systems that we associate with the Chinese government, for instance. From our perspective, we've always been a little skeptical, I think, about AI as a company. It's a very hyped term, and it's also a very ill-defined term. And I think this is one of the challenges as well that the European Union confronts as it tries to scope the AI Act, because when you try to regulate something, you need to define it, right? So that companies also understand, okay, to what extent do I actually fall under this legislation? And AI, I think, is particularly tricky because there's a variety of technologies associated with this. And I think there's essentially a risk of being both under and over-inclusive, because risk is oftentimes very context-specific, right? So it might even be that some of the systems that might intuitively seem low risk, right? Maybe AI in a video game, who knows, right? Could, in the aggregate or in certain contexts, be a risk as well. So I I mean, I think there are certain basically fundamental processing principles that we have in existing legislation, such as the GDPR already. The question is with this, and I think other EU legislative proposals as well, to what extent does this build upon or enhance the existing laws? And then as well, to what extent are you going to create additional regulatory bodies? How are they going to relate to existing regulatory bodies, such as the data protection authorities? And will these bodies have enough funding and enough resources to both fulfill their role of serving as advisory bodies, right, and also entities you can consult, which is an important aspect of the work, but also effectively enforce the functions, because there, I think, is an aspect of trust as well, right? It's one responsibility, an obvious responsibility for technology companies to be transparent and accountable about their work, but I think regulatory bodies also need to have teeth, right? They need to have the resources at their disposal to enforce laws effectively as well, and here I think we've seen some challenges too.
As far as I understand, the term AI was chosen because it's quite open, and the regulation should last for a couple of years, perhaps a decade. And as far as I understand, for sure it's a marketing term in many companies, but I think every big platform uses and integrates somehow AI technologies which are truly artificial intelligence in the more narrow definition. So I think it targets every big tech company. And the second is, you're right. An authority has to have the skills, the teeth, the budget. And it's not sure yet whether the EU only says, goes the first step and misses the second and third. We see in the course of the next years. What I find interesting about when it's when you look at the idea of having a algo authority and an AI act, the idea is that there are ethical principles that you should implement in platforms, so it's irrelevant what kind of character the founder has or any investor has. So it's kind of changing the rule book, and that, I don't know whether that will come true, but maybe we'll see something like that in the course of the next years.
And I think you raise an important point there, right? I completely agree with Professor Schiffrin that there's a variety of legislative areas we need to look in as a society beyond tech as well, right? And I think in the US, obviously, one prominent aspect is the amount of influence that money plays in politics. However, I do also agree with Götz, also from my personal practical experience, right, that it's dangerous to conflate individuals with companies. It's true that Peter Thiel, whom you mentioned extensively, Professor Schiffrin, is one of the co-founders of Palantir, and he sits on our board, but he's one actor in this field, right? Our CEO is Dr. Alex Karp. It's publicly known that he represents the opposite of the spectrum, and I think as a company, we necessarily need to embrace a diversity of views given the complex areas in which we work, right, which oftentimes do not lend themselves to black and white opinions, essentially, right? And I think one aspect that I fear we're losing increasingly as a society as well is that we're becoming increasingly polarized, and we're losing the ability to have a conversation across the political spectrum too, right? So I think this is something that we certainly try to encourage internally. We try to encourage an active debate culture. There's certainly not one single opinion on any given project that we pursue at the company, but I think it's important to maintain that ability to have a healthy conversation.
I think we raised a lot of questions and touched a lot of topics. Shall
I respond?
Yes, sure. Just, Anya, just let me, I want to prepare the audience to ask a question in a few minutes, so so we can open up a bit if needed, if wanted. But please, Anya, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to say that GDPR was incredibly important because it also paved the way for California's privacy law. So it was another example of how what Europe is doing and what Germany does can have a huge influence across the ocean. Completely agree, of course, that enforcement, is a problem. The fact is these huge companies, they avoid the law all the time, and the fines just aren't big enough. The EU has a mechanism for fining, and then, it's just not big enough to make a difference. So I agree with you that all these new laws are going to require a lot more teeth and regulatory approval. Absolutely agree about polarization. And I think it's really important not to act like, the Trump faction of the Republican Party and the Democrats are equivalent, because they're really, really not. I mean, Peter Thiel has said over and over again, he doesn't trust government. He wants to build his own little country, in the ocean outside California. These people are out of the mainstream of discussion, and they're incredibly powerful. So it's really, not fair to make it seem like it's balanced to have a Peter Thiel and a normal person, the outliers. And I think when we talk about polarization, we have to remember that. I mean, there's a sensible middle, and then there's extremists. And when these people have huge amounts of money, they have said they don't believe in government, then we have a problem in our democracy, which is what we have. So I'll close here.
Yeah, and very briefly, I certainly did not mean to comment on any kind of equivalency, right? I wasn't trying to make a statement in that regard. I just think that in this panel, right, we were meaning to discuss the regulation of tech companies as well, right? When it comes to the regulation of individual influence on politics or polarizing views, this is essentially just not the topic of the panel, from my understanding.
What we see in the EU, and we touched the Digital Services Act and the AI Act, is the aim is to hold platforms accountable for what they do, what kind of algorithms they use, how they form the relationship between users and platform. And we see it in the Digital Services Act. You mentioned it already. Platforms have to publish risk reports. The DSA should, we see how, but it should organize in a better way than we had in Europe so far, except Germany, how misuse of platforms can be reported. And the Digital Markets Act wanted to make sure that the big platforms do not misuse their power, their market power, by excluding competitors, by overusing the personal data they have. So there is, in very different fields, I think the approach of the EU regulation is trying to restore public trust in making sure that companies and platforms are held accountable for what they do and to make it more transparent. There are two hands raised, and I'd like to, Josephine, would you just go upstairs and catch one of the questions?
Thank you very much for taking questions and for this panel. Since it is dealing with trust and technology in these platforms and the regulatory aspect, we also have to ask about the public's trust in the regulators, right? Congress in the US, only 10, 12% of Americans actually trust Congress. So do we actually think that, what is the impact of the public's trust in the regulators themselves on all of this? And on the effectiveness of any sort of regulation moving forward. And to Paula, with Palantir, also the use of technology affects the public's trust in it. So for Palantir, are you, for example, in your marketing, do you work, for example, to use your technology in humanitarian situations, say with refugees? Data management around sort of humanitarian crisis is huge. So is this an area as well in which Palantir is working where it's something that could build public trust rather than sort of the opposite? Thank you.
Thank you for these two questions. I would hand over to Anya first to comment on this, and perhaps how or did anything change since Biden took over?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right that trust in government is low. And I think that when it comes to technology regulation, I think the tech companies have done a great job of saying, oh, government's incompetent, they don't know what they're doing. And, you know, they've contributed to that conversation. I mean, I think the US, I think, is still really an outlier, but I think you're absolutely right that the lack, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we can't get good tech regulation passed and enforced, right? And part of it, I'm sure, is trust in Congress, but part of it's also the huge amount of lobbying, the capture. I think our moderator alluded. So I would say there's to the, you know, the unique problems of the American political system. So I think there's a whole lot of reasons why trust is so low in the US. And honestly, when I was first invited, I thought this was only a panel about trust and the history of trust and trust in news. So I can talk about that for hours as well. We don't have, you know, I don't have to talk about
we can organize a follow-up, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'd love to. Sure, I've written a lot about the history of press. Anyway, thanks. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And I'm sure leading up, there's probably millions of great use cases for the kind of data you have, and I'm very eager to hear more about them.
Paula.
Sure, yeah, and thanks for that question. I mean, Palantir has always defined itself as a mission-driven company, right? We started working in the government realm way before that became any kind of profitable suggestion at all, right? Because we realized that there was a very real problem at the beginning of the 2000s, right, of enabling government agencies to identify patterns, essentially, to prevent and fight what we witnessed at 9/11 as well, right? And the platforms continue to be used in the fight against heavy crime, against transnational crime, human trafficking, child trafficking, right? I think these are all goals we can probably agree upon are socially valuable, right? But that also means that we work in oftentimes in highly emotionally charged environments where there is no one answer. We cannot provide any answer alone, right? But what we can do is that we can design our platforms in such a way that certain protections are built in by design. And we can also decide who we work with to begin with, what use cases to pursue, right? Though again, it might not always be a black and white situation. As for your question, do we work in humanitarian environments too? Yes, indeed. Like, we have a long-standing relationship with the World Food Program. We are the first as a company to drop everything and throw our resources at problems when the need arises. And again, I think the COVID-19 vaccination distribution is another use case, right? I mean, Palantir was the backbone for 2 of the most successful vaccination programs in the world, right? So I think these are just some examples for, you know, the value of having a harmonized data environment, but also the importance of making sure that data can be processed responsibly and in accordance for the purposes and the missions that our partners are trying to achieve.
There were more hands raised.
Hi. Many thoughts, but one quick question. So, yes, the social media platforms, they use algorithms that do targeted marketing and targeted feeding, blah, blah, blah. But isn't blaming social media platforms for polarization kind of like blaming the CT scan for showing cancer? CT scan's not the problem, it's the tumor that's the problem. If there's polarization on Facebook, it's because the society is polarized. I mean, you just said Peter Thiel versus normal person. You said third world countries like Philippines, and I find that polarizing, and probably your social media account reflect that. So it's a society that's the problem. You can't blame Facebook. And then where do we stop the line? Are we going to really want to live in a world where somebody living in Facebook's headquarters determines what language and what political messaging is going to go out in the society? And then, because if we do that, we want these companies to regulate, but if they regulate, you're like, no, no, no. You as a private organization cannot determine public discourse. So I just find this to be a little bit, you know, having your cake and eat it too kind of conversation, so yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question and your remark. Something I could go on for hours about it. I won't, I promise. So, Anya, I'm sure that's so close to your work. Please go on.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. So clearly, everyone spent a lot of time analyzing the causes of polarization. And this question that you rightly raised of media effects has been studied really, probably the first systematic literature was in the 1940s, right? After World War II, well, you know, fears about propaganda really arose after World War I, but after World War II, there was a huge amount of study of this exact question. And one of the questions was precisely what you say, you know, is there causality, right? Is it that people have ideas, then they bring them to the news, they reflect them, or is there a media exposure effect? And this has been, you know, widely debated, widely discussed. And I think we really know from research done in the last few years, and I can point to the papers, that there absolutely is, you know, it used to be called the CNN effect. There is an effect from exposure. In fact, I've just been reading a brand new book that came out, you know, 3 months ago about the effect of political news on social media to audiences. Now, it's really important not to generalize, right? We can't say it has the same effect on everybody. There are questions about, again, as I mentioned early, your priors, what you bring. There's the interplay of Fox and social media. But I think at this point, academic social science has absolutely established a correlation between, you know, exposure to mis and disinformation online and all sorts of behavior, including vaccine uptake, including voting patterns. You know, Facebook themselves did their own study. They could nudge people to vote. So absolutely, society is polarized. Not all of the blame can be put on social media, but it would be completely inaccurate to say that there is no such thing as a media effect. We have all kinds of randomized control trials now. We have all kinds of new studies. You know, in the 1950s, people didn't think there was a media effect and they couldn't document it. But the data and understanding and research has become much more sophisticated, really even the last few years. So as academics, we need to update our ideas because there's new evidence. So thank you for that. And then as for censorship regimes and other points, I'm happy to discuss that, but I don't want to take the whole time because I know we have a lot of time left.
I think there's one that was only the first half of the remark and the question. But I would suggest that we take the second half to the after show party because it's really quite getting complex if we talk about take-down cultures and the budget and the power and the language capacity platforms invest in kind of reacting on reported misuse and so on, and that developed over time, and countries are different and so on. So that's really something we could talk about later, perhaps. But there were more hands. I see one or two more. If you, the two of you, Paula, Anya, if you have still the time, I think we take 2 short questions, and then I would invite you to make a short closing remark, if you may. So, first question.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Thank you so much. I have 2 questions. The first one maybe for both panelists. The second one maybe for Paula. I think, you know, we live in a world where we have global problems, and it does not work anymore that we only have one side of, it doesn't work that we only have public institutions who deal with those, and we really need to have an involvement from the entire society. And so here I think it's really important for regulation purposes to have an actual collaboration between public institutions but actually the technology companies, because how can we then develop that regulation so that it works if we don't have an actual dialogue? And in a sense, maybe a personal view, it feels to me like it's difficult to incentivize or create that collaboration, you know, between the public institutions and the private ones, so that we understand the systems we have and then create something that works together. And I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of how do we take it to a more proactive role and we find the solutions and we work together so we can identify an actual regulation that works. And then the second question would be, I understand that your company also discloses personal data then to the police forces, for example. And I know that there are other companies similar in the business that are taking a more conservative approach, and they clearly say they do not intend to do so. I mean, for legal purposes, I think, it also surveillance. If it's for an illegal act, I think you can find a legal basis for that. But I would love to hear more from you, Paula, in terms of how have you been perceived from other similar companies in your business? And do you feel like your company's position has influenced a bit maybe the other ones to also rethink their standing? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a lot more than one question, I think. Let me try to extract two things because of the time we have left. One thing is sure, there is communication, we call it lobbying, and there's a lot of it, and there are congresses and panels and so I think there is enough conversation. But the question that you have raised is whether, is there any case, any example, best practice, where we have another form of fruitful dialogue that leads or ever led to a regulation in the field of big tech or in other fields that we could refer to as a best practice example for a better regulation process and a better involvement of private companies?
Maybe I can briefly start just with the second question, just to essentially also clarify something, because the way you described it, and it might be a terminology thing, is that we disclose data to a police agency. This, I think, would be an inaccurate description. We provide platforms, right, to our customers, platforms that enable them to integrate data that they already have in a unified form environment. We also work together with police agencies. They need to work with a variety of data. Oftentimes this data does not come in humanly intuitive forms. It comes in tables, right? Like, when I look at an Excel sheet, it doesn't mean anything to me, right? What we enable these institutions to do is basically to integrate this into one environment where you can make more sense of it in a way that I understand, right? Like, let's say like somebody makes a phone call, you can actually see on a map where this phone call came from, where it went, right? It's not black magic or anything, but it's an underappreciated challenge of data integration, right? So we do not collect, store, or process any data for our own purposes, right? We don't have any data at all, and unlike many other Silicon Valley companies, our business model is not based on the monetization of personal data. We license out software. So it's true that we have law enforcement agencies as customers, but they bring their own data and they process that data in our platforms. And we provide, it's our responsibility to provide the functionalities that enable them to do so in a compliant way. But I think this brings us to maybe a higher level question and something I often witness as well, right? I mean, I joined Palantir from academia, right? And for me, in a way, it was fascinating as well to then all of a sudden work in the private sector, and particularly for a company that works in so many different industries at the same time, right? Sometimes I feel like an anthropologist, like how are these institutions actually dealing with digital challenges? And one of the first projects that I was staffed on, because I started working for Palantir in New York, was actually in a US investigatory context. And what I was sort of shocked and surprised to find in a way was actually how limited the IT infrastructure sometimes also was of law enforcement and investigatory authorities, right? I think it's very important to have this public conversation because it's also important to see what the status quo actually is, right? What are some of the data challenges that law enforcement agencies face, considering that crime is increasingly transnational, it's increasingly happening in the digital space. You may very well have a warrant, right, for information, and maybe your computer cannot even handle that amount of information. So I can basically like include this in I can make this my closing statement, right? Basically, I think trust is something that comes from having open conversations and open in the sense of also listening to your counterpart and understanding where they're coming from and what kind of challenges they face, and then finding a constructive solution together. I think software companies have a role to play. We have things to offer that are of value to society, but we need to be regulated as well, and this regulation needs to come from the public, certainly, not from individuals or from companies.
Okay, perhaps we have to leave the first question to further research or to the discussion in the after-show party. And Anya, maybe so, as Paula already, would you go on and add a closing remark as well?
Oh, I thought Paula put it beautifully. I don't have a lot to add. I know we're out of time, but just to say that there has been, as you pointed out, lots and lots of discussion. You know, if you go to Facebook, they're perfectly nice people. They think they're doing a great job contributing to solving the problem. And if I sound frustrated, it's because it's been years and it's in many ways getting worse. I mean, the amount of like COVID disinformation, for example. So I think what we've seen is that the conversations aren't really enough. And I totally agree with both of you. That's where regulation has to come in. And regulators are voted for by people. We vote for them, right? For those big companies. So again, they're not exactly equivalent. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really sorry I'm not in person with all of you. This has been super interesting and really grateful to you. So thanks for all your time and for all the interesting discussion today. Yes,
thank you, Paula. Thank you, Anya. It was a fantastic and intense debate, I think, and it's a broad topic, as we see, touching more or less every aspect of human society. What we see and what is different to the, we would have had a different discussion 2 years earlier or 3 years earlier, because now we're really talking about solutions. Nobody's discussing whether there is a problem or a challenge. And that really changed. The landscape has changed, and that always is something that at least leaves me kind of hoping for something coming up that has impact in the EU over the next month, and hoping as well that it may have impact in other parts of the world as well. We'll see, perhaps that may be a topic for next year's discussion. Hope to see you soon again. Thank you for your attention in the audience, and yeah, have a nice evening.